That is the fundamental problem in most of the supply chains that we see in the current times. We don't have trust with one another, so I will just not share information. Blockchain, in my opinion, solves a lot of problems. How it will solve, that is for us to figure out. Go back to this food trust example. One of the reasons they failed is because they did not use a blockchain. They used a private blockchain, which is not exactly a blockchain. I feel that the solution for this should be a public blockchain. And that is why I always emphasize to be able to get things going in a public blockchain, identity is one crucial piece.
Welcome to another episode of the Untangling Web3 podcast. Today, we are thrilled to have Nikhil Varma with us to talk about supply chains in Web3. Nikhil is an associate professor at Ramampo College in New Jersey and a technology lead for the Algorand Foundation in India. In both roles, he specializes in operations and supply chain, blockchain, and sustainability. With over 20 years of experience, he bridges the gap between technology and business, making him a leading authority in these areas. In today's episode, we'll dive into how Web3 technologies are revolutionizing supply chains, enhancing efficiency, and promoting sustainability. Nikhil, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alec. Thank you, Jack, for giving me the opportunity. Of course, this is a very interesting area and looking forward to this conversation that we're going to have today.
Yeah, definitely likewise, Nikhil. Something we've talked about a lot on the show. Supply chains, we want to kind of dig into those. But how are you today, first of all?
I'm doing good. I'm just on the road. I've been traveling for the last almost 2 weeks out of home, living in hotels, going from one place to the other, enjoying myself, communicating the message of Web3 to different communities, different types of communities all across India. So it's been fun.
Yeah, it sounds like you're a true kind of missionary for the visions of Web3. So, and I want to get into your role in Algorand Foundation a bit later. But first of all, I want to just start by digging into the main topic, right? Supply chain. So it's a use case that we've talked about a lot on the show. In our end of year kind of highlights, look back episode, we saw a clip of Alec talking in depth about supply chain use cases of blockchain. But we want to get the view of an expert here, right? So in your view, can you explain what is a supply chain in kind of layman's terms and why are they so important?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that people do when they not do the nomenclature of things is they think a lot and give a nice name, which is very suggestive. However, in the classroom, I never call it a supply chain. And even in industry now, people have started calling it the value chain. So a supply chain sometimes is very misleading. It's like, oh, my list of suppliers is what supply chain is all about. But when we actually are studying supply chain, even from a technological or a managerial or even to be able to optimize things, we actually have to look at the whole value proposition. What is the value chain over here? So, in if I had to define supply chain in one word, or kind of clarify what supply chain is, I would say it's the nomenclature is wrong. We should call it value chain.
Okay, then. Okay, so we've already have to change the title of this episode, I think, from supply chains to value chains. But that's already an interesting insight from you. Okay, so what is a value chain then, and why are value chains important for us?
So the whole idea of supply chain is to facilitate commerce, right? There is a flow of goods from upstream to downstream. And that flow of goods from upstream to downstream is nothing but a value exchange at each step, right? And that value exchange at each step has its own salient features. And that's essentially what we are trying to optimize, study, and have all those, social and economic aspects around it, and now even environmental, to be able to make it more sustainable. So that value exchange process, if we study it from a value exchange perspective, is much more easy to study. And that's why we use the word value chain, to be able to make sure people understand it very clear that, if you are producing something and you're selling it to the next person, you are exchanging the value of what you have with, for money or whatever. Of course, money most of the times. So that exchange of value between two people has to be defined within certain sets of regulations. It has to have the government norms. You can't do a trade with a country that you can't, which the government does not allow you to do things with. You have to make sure that the trade is fair. You have to make sure that the trade does not have a huge carbon footprint. Now, that being very important. You have to make sure that whatever is the exchange of money is reported correctly. You have to make sure that it is efficient. You have to make sure a lot of other things, which, the more dimensions we study, the more better we make it, essentially.
Mm,
Now, this value exchange often is studied from a duopoly perspective, which means basically I am going to just know the person on my upstream or my downstream. And this is often happens because we don't have trust,
mm.
right? And that is the fundamental problem in most of the supply chains that we see in the current times. We don't have trust with one another, so I will just not share information. And if I share
Mm.
information, then maybe my downstream person might directly start working with my upstream person. Who knows? There could be something called a vertical integration, and vertical integration takes away all the exchange of values because there's one player who holds the monopoly, right? So these are some initial problems that we see in the supply chain.
Okay, that's really useful to know, and we're already starting to get onto some of the concepts of why trust is important in these things, and we're maybe starting to see some of the opportunities that Web3 technologies present. Like I know a little about supply chains, like very shallow, as like Jack said. They're vast, they're everywhere. I think everything that's more complicated than a pencil probably has some value or supply chain underpinning that. But you're the expert in this space. Just to make it a bit more concrete, because a lot of these terms, like you say, are very abstract. Could you give us an example of like end-to-end supply chain or value chain and who the actors are involved in that, just so we can understand what this is?
Sure. So, I mean, whenever we are talking about a value exchange, we will, as you mentioned, end to end. This whole definition of end to end is, again, since we don't have a holistic view, right, of the whole value chain, it'll be difficult. But when we are studying the value chain, then we'll probably, every person is a customer of the other, right? One person is the
Mm,
seller, other person is the customer. Now, let's take an example of a commonly used item, which is coffee. Yeah. Now, coffee in the supply chain of coffee, what are the different players who come into play? Yeah, you have the coffee plantations. The coffee plantation is going to have people working in those plantations, working day and night to be able to raise to get the coffee. Now, then in those plantations, somebody is going to take those the coffee pods out. Then that there is some kind of an integrator in between after that. So that integrator is the next part of the supply chain or the value chain, just to be able to be consistent with the term that I'm going to be using. Then the next player in that is going to be that integrator is going to be sending it to an exporter. The exporter is going to be then sending it to a roaster. The roaster is then going to be sending it to different kinds of companies, retailers maybe, or different brands. Then it goes to the retailer, and then it goes all the way to the customer. Yeah.
mm,
So this is the whole supply chain of coffee. Yeah, that ways if we look at and I'm giving you overly simplified supply chain over here. There are no components, there are no other players who come in, there are no people who are doing any kind of integration. There is some kind of a value addition that each people bring into this picture, and there is no suggestion that they should not be a part of this picture. However, this supply chain works with power centers over here. There is not a fair distribution of power when we look at a supply chain like this. We see that the person who's closest to the customer tends to create that demand, then that demand flows backwards. There are some kind of mechanisms. Either there are international markets if their coffee is a commodity or different brands of coffee is a commodity, then that demand goes back. That demand, based on that demand, there are different people who do different kind of procurement, and then that procurement leads to the purchasing or the import of coffee from various places. Looking at one single product which just passes through various hands, of course there are people who do some value addition like the roaster, is much more easier to understand. A supply chain, complex supply chains could be, just look at the phone that they have in your hand, right? It's overly complex because there are like over 100 different components coming in from 25 different countries. Yeah,
mm,
and you don't even know. You just know where where your phone was integrated at the very end. Yeah. So imagine the kind of complexities that we have here, and the kind of power centers that we have to deal with, and the kind of risks and disruptions One small disruption in chipsets manufacturing during the COVID time uh, impacted the whole car distribution industry. Yeah. I mean, it's just mind boggling how this whole supply chain, value chain works, because now we are talking about a global economy. Very few supply chains are very local. And in fact, they are overly simplified, which is basically local production, local consumption kind of a model. But most of the things that we consume, either these are items or food or anything that we have, go through international boundaries, and the complexities are immense.
I love that kind of the segue you've given there. It's the one that I was going to actually use as well. Is that globalization has kind of been the reason why economies have expanded so quickly. Technologies have been able to advance so quickly. Like it's a good thing, right? It's a really good thing. And but it does, on the other hand, make supply chains really complex. And a lot of people don't understand how cross-border so many things like their devices are. But this was really highlighted with COVID, when all of a sudden it was really hard to pass from place to place, from country to country, because there was a COVID spike here and you didn't know if there was going to be COVID on your phone device and all this kind of stuff. And it really highlighted the fragility of a lot of these supply chains, right? So, on that kind of note, what are some of the problems that we're actually experiencing right now in modern supply chains?
So one of the key things when we look at supply chain is, uh, we call it resilience of the supply chain. Okay, how resilient is your supply chain? And when we look at resilient models that we build into the supply chain, there are different kinds of contingencies that are planned. Okay, however, a contingency for COVID absolutely was not there, because this was complete, the whole world kind of froze for a certain period of time, and we didn't know which was stuck where, right? And the impacts are so far reaching that even in 2024 we are still facing disruptions here and there which we were not able to predict. So resilience in supply chain is one of the things. The other thing in supply chain is the disruption aspect. Resili- I mean, we studied how resilient a supply chain is to disruption, but there could be disruptions with global activities like war, right? You have two countries which are, in fact, four countries, five countries fighting with one another, having, there comes a regulation, we'll not stop doing business with this country, or any company who is based out of this country, we're going to ban them. Yeah. But the impacts are so far reaching that we don't even know how long it will take us to see the effects of that decision. Yeah, on a political basis, yes, you have to do what you have to do, but on a supply chain basis, there is no mechanism at this point of time. Ideally, like, in this day and age when we have analytics, right? You have a GPS and you say, you know what, I want to take a stop, and then go from here to there. It'll tell you, oh, if you take that, it'll take you 5 minutes more, which is called prescriptive analytics. Tells you that, if you change things, what's going to happen. But we don't have anything like a prescriptive analytics for supply chain at this point of time, which would mean, like, what happens if the energy costs increase? How is my supply chain going to be impacted? There is no mechanism, there's no dashboard that any company is going to get to know about it. What happens if our relationship with China, you know gets worse, suppose, we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, of course, we know something is going to happen, but we are not able to do the impact analysis of that. What happens if the Ukraine war continues for another 2 years? I hope not, but suppose it continues for another 2 years. What is the impact on the economy? What is the global economy? So, what all that we do is historical analysis. We can't do a predictive analysis. And if we can't do a predictive analysis, the biggest problem that happens is all these people who are a part of the supply chain, they don't even know how their lives are going to be impacted. So all we can do is speculate and say we are going to have a slowdown in economy, but we don't know when the slowdown is coming. We're waiting for the slowdown, right? So these are some problems of globalization. However, we cannot do away with globalization. That's not what I'm suggesting. Some economies have started suggesting that, oh, we should produce local, consume local. Yeah, that's good for simple supply chain. If you're growing local tomatoes, you can have it there. If you're having fish, yes, you can have it locally. But what about your smartphone? What about your computing device? What about your routers? If you want to produce local, it's like boiling the ocean. It's impossible to do it, right? There'll be something or the other that you need from another location. So these are, I feel, challenges, opportunities for researchers. I mean, I've been trying to look at this avenue of doing a prescriptive analytics for a decision making process in any kind of a supply chain. Like, study the supply chain and see the impact, finding the levers, which are the levers which is going to impact me in what way.
Thanks for giving us that overview of the challenges. I think you've highlighted some really important ones there, and I hadn't thought about this prescriptive analytics piece yet, which is really interesting. You mentioned this idea of, well, one solution potentially being going local, but actually that's not practical in a lot of cases. We're in the UK. We know very well that this is not a particularly practical situation because we're so heavily reliant on imports. And speaking of supply chains, not only do we have the impact of COVID on supply chains, we also have Brexit, right? We have imposed
Sure.
a new trust boundary basically between us and the European Union now. And I've seen recently they've had to put in something like 4.7 billion pounds worth of investment to facilitate this new trust barrier between the two jurisdictions. And it's going to cost businesses themselves something like 330 million pounds per year to go through these new checks, right? So that just shows the value extraction or value loss you get when you have these trust boundaries, creating inefficiencies in supply chains. I think it's one of the examples that's really struck me. So moving on to then, blockchain and Web3, do you see that as a magic bullet? I mean, typically we think not. And we've seen lots of different initiatives in supply chain to do with blockchain. So maybe first, why do you think blockchain is being considered as a solution? What part of the problems you outlined is blockchain and Web3 poised to actually address and people are excited about, do you think?
Sure. So one of the things that I had in mind when I was answering about all these issues and problems that we face in the current times with supply chain was based on the fact that there is very little or no Web3 blockchain implementations in supply chain as yet. Okay, I started off by calling it a value exchange process. Your value chain where we exchange value, and trust being a key construct of all supply chain. So when we study supply chain, one of the things we talk about supply chain is that we need to have a relational supply chain to be able to make sure that it is resilient. Yeah. Now, we all know that the whole construct of relational is always has some kind of interference with the brand value, right? So if you are going to engage in any kind of a commerce, any kind of a trade with anyone, you would first want to make sure that person is valid, correct? That person
Hmm.
or that entity has some kind of credibility. You want to make sure they are able to demonstrate that you can sue them or do whatever if they don't deliver the things that as they have promised, or they have the ability to deliver. Yeah. And now with sustainability, it even becomes more complex. You want to make sure that your supply chain does not have any kind of child labor, any kind of workforce exploitation. They don't have a huge carbon footprint, so on and so forth, right? When we look at things like this, what does it come to our mind? This can only be afforded by a big organization, correct? You can have only limited organizations in the current times who are able to engage in actually face-to-face commerce. They might be integrated in the back end, but in the front end, these are bigger organizations who can engage in any kind of a commerce, right? Now, the moment that you have an integration of organizations, then you have these smaller players who have the ability to do things, but there is an entry barrier for them. Yeah. What does Web3 do for us? What does blockchain do for us? Blockchain brings in this decentralized trust, this technology mediated trust. And the moment you get in this technology mediated trust is all we have to make sure is we write those smart contracts carefully. Yeah. And we have the right kind of
Hmm.
oracles, right? And we can create a decentralized marketplace. Now, I'm not saying decentralization is the answer to everything. In fact, I believe decentralization is a state N, is not state zero. If you start with decentralization, you're only going to create a lot of commotion. Yeah.
Hmm.
However, in bits and pieces, if we are able to decentralize things in our supply chain, with the decentralized, which with a blockchain based system which preserves privacy, then we will have a supply chain which is more connected with one another rather than just a duopoly happening in each of these places. Yeah. So blockchain, in my opinion, solves a lot of problems. How it will solve? That is for us to figure out. Yeah, it will bring in efficiencies, it will open the doors for smaller players, it will make sure, we will be able to make sure that if we are claiming that these are the raw materials, or this product that we are eating is actually, comes in from organic, is actually organic. Yeah, and not that, somebody big brand is claiming it to be organic and hence it is organic, or whether this product was transported in the right temperature. How do we get to know? Because nobody is going to share the data after the duopoly. Yeah. So
Mhm.
I'm going to share it with my downstream. But then my downstream, what they do with that, I don't know, because it's a database system. Anybody can
Mm.
alter things. Blockchain can help us with those kind of things. And I feel, it'll take a bit of a time for us to start imagining structures that would be a pure decentralized framework, but in bits and pieces, if we are able to start, like the first thing which I always tell people is, before we jump into blockchain, the most important thing that we need to crack is identity.
Yeah.
If we are not cracking identity, we will not be able to solve the blockchain puzzle, or the supply chain puzzle, or the value chain puzzle with blockchain, because identity has to be transcendental. If you go in and open a wallet in the current times in any kind of a public blockchain, you know of course, I know both of you are great guys, but then when we are doing a trade, I need to make sure that you are who you are in some form, right? Even if it is a zero knowledge proof, but I need to make sure you are who you are. Unless and until we make those mechanisms, because blockchain came in from a very libertarian view. We don't want to give our name, we don't want to do this, we don't want to do that. We have to find some kind of a convergence between a country identity, a regulatory identity, and the decentralized identity, to be able to make sure that we are able to crack this puzzle.
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack there. It really resonates with me, the idea of the decentralized trust you're talking about, right? Because as I said, these trust borders we have, when you have two entities in any value chain, that and you have many of these pairs in maybe the production and distribution of one good, you have so many of these relationships where you have trust boundaries. I think absolutely blockchain can play a role in mediating that, right? We have this whole idea of peer to peer. Well, these are all peer-to-peer interactions in some sense that you have between the initial production of something and then it getting in the hands of the end customer. So I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it. Now, you also kind of touched on the fact that this is an evolving living beast, right? And it's not necessarily a solved problem, even if we have some of the components. So if you look back at like 2016, 17, 18, IBM more or less came out looking like this was a solved problem, right? Saying blockchain was a magic bullet. They came out with IBM Food Trust to tackle the food supply chain traceability. They came out with Trade Lens, right, to tackle the shipping industry with Maersk. And all of that kind of seems to have died off. It was using a more private model. So I want to ask you, what kind of specific use cases or specific projects or directions, because again, you seems like you think this isn't necessarily a solved issue, but what do you think are the most promising avenues that people are exploring with Web3 and supply chain right now?
Sure. And before I kind of talk about what is the problem now, let me just go back to this food trust example, and the shipping example that you came up with. I feel one of the reasons they failed is because they did not use a blockchain. They used a private blockchain, which is not exactly a blockchain. A private blockchain is controlled by an organization. They might aspire to be a blockchain, but when the governance is under your control, the nodes are what you're running. I think it's very difficult to scale something like that. It's going to be one player who's going to be a monopoly, which means I'm going and telling you, suppose I set up a private blockchain and say, oh, trust me, or the whole world is going to trust me. But then what if I go rogue and start sharing information with one another, or start changing information because governance is under my control? I feel that the solution for this should be a public blockchain. And that is why I always emphasize, to be able to get things going in a public blockchain, identity is one crucial piece. And coming to the things that are being currently solved, or currently which appear to be solved in a blockchain based solution, I feel is primarily to do with supply chain traceability. I think traceability is one key aspect around which we are able to build a lot of things in supply chain. Traceability also carries the trust right from the source to the end consumer. So traceability has different facets to it. There could be a traceability which has to do with the production traceability, whether this product was produced the way it's supposed to be produced. That's one of the things that we are seeing, which is more based IoT integration, where a product goes through a whole production pipeline. Each of these pipelines, you have an IoT system which is monitoring that. So essentially, when it goes through that IoT system and it complies to the contract which it is supposed to comply with, only then the product would be tokenized. Suppose, yeah. So I won't let you tokenize unless until each of these. So if I go through step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, only then I'll let you tokenize. Otherwise, it's not a product. You get me? And each of these steps have an IoT encoding process. So this would work wonders in pharmaceutical manufacturing, for example, where we hear all the time that pharmaceutical manufacturers, not that they want to make counterfeit goods, but when you go for contract manufacturing, sometimes they are only regulated or tested by a sampling kind of a model. You can't test every single drug, otherwise you'll have to eat that drug or destroy the drug. So to be able to do away with that sampling testing, you are able to have an IoT device which will monitor that. Yeah, of course, the point of failure is the IoT device. I do agree. But if the IoT device is configured right, it's like your taximeter, right? I mean, somebody just alters the taximeter, what can we do? But then, that can be somehow secured. And we know that IoT devices are getting smarter and smarter by the day. So if we are able to break down those production processes, and that is an IoT based traceability, then you will be able to make sure that the product is what it is supposed to be. That's one form of traceability. The other form of traceability is that if I am saying that this product came from place X, yeah, and it traveled to me at 7 degrees centigrade, frozen food, yeah. Most of the times we go to the store and we buy frozen food. Do we even know whether it was transported at the right temperature? No, we just trust that brand that they are going to give us food which is not, because if it did not get transported the right temperature, which means that the expiration date on that food is not correct, right? So we could have an IoT based traceability. I mean, imagine having that overhead of having somebody to actually observe each one of them. That could not be possible. But the IoT based system could verify the authenticity of this particular thing. The other thing is, another kind of traceability is a mass based traceability. This is coming a big way in organic food, biofuel, green hydrogen. And we are seeing lots of use cases emerge in that area. I'll give you an example. The amount of organic food that we consume in various parts of the world. I'll give you an example of United States. The amount of organic food that is sold in the market is way more than the organic food that is produced. Okay, so what happens in the intermediary? And we all know organic food has a shelf life. Now, if we are able to tie this to a mathematical routine, so if it goes from the main producer, the producer has 100 different intermediaries whom they sell to in their, in the downstream, the producer gives a certificate that this is an organic food. Now, the certificate is going to be a lot of overhead if you have a Web2 system. Now, imagine you have a million tokens which would represent each of those items of, say, tomatoes here. Yeah. So I want to give you a certificate that this tomato, out of the million you bought 100,000 from me, I'll give you 100,000 certificates. Then that 100,000, this guy goes and sells another 50,000 to one, 20,000 to another, 30,000 to the other one. So then you have these certificates which are generated by the system. So essentially, my system will not generate an organic certificate downstream if I don't have a proof that I receive certificates. That ways, you don't need to know who's at the upstream, but that certificate would maintain the integrity of the product. That's called a mass balance model. This works for a lot of things. Like if you sell green hydrogen, hydrogen is hydrogen, right? Whether it is green or not, how do we ascertain that? So you get certificates at the very beginning. Those certificates would maintain the integrity of that. So essentially, there will be no people. And it's much more complicated than that. You could have value additions in the middle or what. But these are some use cases that we are seeing now. Okay. There is another use case, if I may say, which is very close to me, my heart, and I feel that at some time should be at a global scale, and that has to do with finance and supply chain tied together. And this is a token launched out of Argentina and Brazil. They're called Agro Token. They launched on Algorand. And this agro token uses a very interesting mechanism to be able to create some kind of liquidity for farmers from the time they planted their seeds. So one of the biggest problems that farmers face is that they have to, you know, get their crop, go to the market, sell it. Only then they are able to get that money. Yeah. And for that time period, usually in developing countries, we have seen the farmers go and take loans from loan sharks. And, this is this whole vicious circle of poverty that they keep going. By the time they get the money, they already, all the crop that they've grown, the money is already going to be going back to that loan shark. And these people are been, controlling these people for centuries here.
Mm.
Now, interesting thing over here is based on satellite data, weather data, all kinds of risk model, international future market price of the crop, there is a valuation done. Again, you have identity of the farmer, you have a token which actually has what is the land that they have, that they own or where they're growing their crop. Based on that, what is also the type of crop that they're growing. Based on that, there is a value, future value of the crop that is determined, and they get liquidity on a Visa card. So essentially, their future crop is tokenized to give them liquidity. And that liquidity is with which they are able to run till they raise the crop. And when the crop is ready to be sold, they bond those tokens by paying the money. And essentially, then it's trade as commerce as usual. So some beautiful use cases are coming, which was not possible with Web2.
Thank you, Nikhil. I mean, you've given us such a good oversight of so many different things in the kind of like a quick fire round on all the possibilities that Web3 and blockchain bring to this space. And I completely agree. And there's so many things that, as Jack would say, I want to double click on there. But you're like the kind of the overview of, trust in data is so important, right? And that's what blockchains provide in many ways. But I think, like you said, relating that trusted data to someone is so important as well. And that's the next stage, right? And there's such a kind of pressing need for decentralized or digital identity in this space to actually aggregate the data and relate it to an individual or a business or whatever it is. And I think like a kind of a segue there for both those things is IoT, right? Because you say as soon as the data is on the blockchain, I can trust it. But what about the actual collection of that data? And I think IoT is so important for that to actually say, the classic garbage in, garbage out. It doesn't matter if the data is like immutable and tamper proof and all this stuff if it wasn't collected properly. And IoT, in a way, helps reduce the likelihood of data being collected in the wrong way. Or if it is collected in the wrong way, you can actually get some analytics that are actually part of the data to say this is how it was collected. This is some of the error messages that came with it potentially. But you're reducing the human error there. But I think IoT also relates to the idea of digital identities. When you're talking about IoT operating in these kind of open, trustless, potentially spaces, then you might need to start thinking about how you can have digital identity for your IoT devices so they can say have a history that relates to them, or they can actually start to exchange goods on themselves. They can start to commit, have some more agency, start to commit payments as soon as they've hit decision gates. And I think IoT and supply chain is going to be such an interesting kind of, I guess, center point for a lot of these different technologies to emerge towards. I think we're going to see, obviously, as well, AI is going to be in there, or there'll be lots of data analytics occurring of the vast amounts of data that's taking this IoT data and making it useful for a human to make an end decision. There's just so many things that we could talk about. Even the fact you were talking about the certificates there, and the carbon credits is obviously a big booming area. But like you say, there's more spent than there actually are produced, because you've got this double spending problem in a way where they're actually, everyone's exchanging carbon credits, but not that many are being generated. So you're like, okay, where are they all coming from? Like, you actually need a way to actually say, okay, this is authentic. This is the only one. And if you're not spending it from here with this signature across it, then it's probably not real, and we're not going to count it, for example. But like you say, there's so many different examples that you could go into. One of the questions I had for you, because you've been in this space for some time now, is that people have been talking about blockchain-based supply chains for, I think, like 10 plus years now. And like you say, it's like there have been some, it's not really mainstream. Like you said, what is taking so long to get this technology adopted in the mainstream?
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things when somebody asked me about why blockchain is not in the mainstream, even in supply chain or anywhere, I want to I always take people through this whole journey of how blockchain has evolved over the years. Yeah. Uh, how did we actually got into this whole blockchain discussion was 2007, 2008 with the launch of Bitcoin. Yeah. And then Bitcoin, as we all know, was very libertarian because people lost trust in institutions and all kinds of things happened. And then Bitcoin earned a very bad name because of the Silk Route and so on and so forth. The people started saying, oh, this is only for evil people here. Yeah. Until something very amazing happened with the Ethereum launch, which actually created a different kind of a perspective, so which is where blockchains moved away from that libertarian view to a more decentralized organization perspective. Yeah, where you have smart contracts, you have automation, you have so on and so forth. Yeah, so there is transition in the view of how blockchain has happened from libertarian to decentralization. Now, that was generation two. Then we had another set of problems with ICOs coming in, people launching tokens, creating all that white paper, and then suddenly disappearing with whatever money was there. That created another set of issues. So crypto took center stage, and blockchain took as somewhere got lost. Yeah, it was not until generation three platforms that have come in, which might support building tokens. It's not that generation three is not about, but then they started looking at more enterprise grade solution. Let's talk about transaction speed. Let's talk about no transaction finality, which is a very big problem, mind you. I mean, if you see the in the grand scheme of things, if somebody tells you, hey, you can continue doing transaction, but you know what, we could possibly fork at some point, people would freak out on you. What are you talking about? Right? So transaction finality is important. Transaction cost is very important. If is I used to do some kind of modeling for people, and they said, okay, what could be my transaction cost if I like that depends on network bandwidth and network congestion. And they were like, I need to make sure that this doesn't inflate too much, otherwise it will be not a sustainable business for me. So yes, good thing happened with layer 2 in generation 2, but then layer 2 is still as good as the substrate layer, which is good. Of course, Ethereum is still has the biggest ecosystem, but why I like the generation 3 is that they are cutting that crypto noise and focusing on blockchain revolution. So I feel that unless and until we start thinking enterprise with public blockchain, we will not be able to achieve. And that's why it's taken us a lot of time, because we have got into this generation three platforms who have a different kind of mindset only very recently. These are 3 4 year old back. And of course, that was the time when we were all locked in and introspecting whether we will be able to make it for the next 5 years or not, right? And good for us as a as all of us moved out of that. Uh, but the main thing that blockchain has not taken center stage is because of this whole transition that is happening in the blockchain space. Even now, I come across many people who think very much in a very that no government, no institution, nothing. And then I go and tell them, okay, fine, let's do a supply chain problem with your mindset. Do you think people are going to join your network without having an identity? Do you think they will be able to engage in a legal commerce in a country without having an identity? And they're like, no, this if we are going to be very close to government, then we are breaking this whole thing. So I think one of the things which I would always ask people to introspect when they're building applications in blockchain is that we have to give away a bit of decentralization to be compliant, but we can smartly give away that part of decentralization. There is a cycle of centralization and decentralization that we are going all the time. At some point these blockchains would be centralized. I hate to say that, but that's the fact. Okay, and eventually we'll find another technology to make us decentralized. The only thing is what part of the business can be decentralized and what part we have to centralize to be able to make sure we have the regulatory compliance. Not that we are trying to kind of make the governments happy, but at the same time you are operating within the norms of a government, and if you say I don't care for the government, I'm not reporting anything to the government, then you're always going to be on the periphery. You're not going to come into the mainstream. That's the problem.
I love that assessment. I think it's so apt. Like we've seen so much of the kind of the mainstream media and maybe even like the investment as well has just been focused on the crypto side, right? And there's a lot of negative connotations around that. How much energy is it using for the amount of utility it's actually providing? Like, what problem is it trying to solve? And even outside of that, like you say, like consulting 101 is you take people on a journey of like phases to get somewhere. And if they're like in a super centralized model right now, and you're saying the next stage is fully decentralized, get rid of all the intermediaries, everyone's gonna be like, well, crap, we don't want to do this, do we? That sounds horrible. And like, I think this is why this term that we've started to use in the podcast more and more is this Web 2.5 model, where you decentralize the aspects you can for now and probably have the trusted intermediaries still in there, but more and more you try and decentralize what you can, with the end goal probably being as decentralized as possible. But you'd always need an intermediary somewhere. Like when we talk about digital identity systems, for example, you'd always need a government to say, this is your passport and you are who you say you are. But you can decentralize more aspects of that, maybe the verification, maybe the ownership and all this kind of stuff. But I completely agree with you. So we're coming to the end of the show here, Nikhil, and this has been really insightful, and I've learned a lot. But when I first saw you online, this says all came about. I saw that you cover a lot of topics and you digest them so well. And I was like, okay, we need to get this guy on. He's going to be great. But I have no idea what topic he's going to cover, because he speaks about so many things so well online. And what I want to get from you is, what are you most excited for in terms of what areas, what use cases most excite you for the future of Web3 and blockchain? And this can be outside of supply chain if you want.
I mean, supply chain is, anyways, the value chain is where we all live in. I mean,
Mm,
we can't be living in a box, anyways. But one of the things which I feel is this whole area of sustainability. And we are doing a lot of things in India around that. And you did mention about carbon credits. I think carbon credits is just a piece of it. There are many more sustainable initiatives like water credits, plastic credits, so on and so forth. These are very difficult things because, as we know, carbon credits, as much as they were, you know, the Kyoto Protocol, the Kyoto Agreement was meant to create an economic model around it, but we've abused that system left, right, and center, and there are power centers, power brokers everywhere. With all due respect to people who do work honestly there, I don't mean to be saying everybody's dishonest, but the point over here is that when we have any kind of an human intervention to be able to come in and look at a sample of how much carbon credits I'm going to be getting for this is subject to error. In this day and age, this has to be automated. And you did talk about IoT. So we are looking at actual data backed carbon credits. Of course, I in grand scheme of things, I would bring in artificial intelligence over there also to be able to make sure those IoT devices are not manipulated at some point of time. That would be another integration with AI. But as of now, in a very grounded scheme of things, we are looking at data backed, and there are a few other things that comes out of this which I'm really excited about. So data backed carbon credits which are fair in nature. Okay, as of now, carbon credits is an integrator's game. If you actually have to certify yourself or your project with gold standard, the amount of money that's required is not something which a small farmer who's doing sustainable farming can afford, right? And when, as we all know, if we have power brokers over there, these power brokers are going to control everything. They'll invest. Okay, fine, the farmer becomes sustainable. What is the incentive to the farmer who's making ends meet to be able to continuously do things in a sustainable manner? If I create another avenue, revenue source for this farmer for doing sustainable agriculture, that is when the magic is going to happen. And that is what I'm extremely excited about. That is what I'm extremely motivated to continue working on. And I feel a fair smart contract based model where these intermediaries are value addition people. I'm not even suggesting that they don't add value to this. If this system becomes a smart contract based system, a data backed system, a tokenized carbon credits, then it's going to be very beautiful. And the other thing, which again is a hope, I don't think it's going to be happening pretty soon, is a decentralized system altogether. Why do I need an exchange if I follow a methodology? Right, and if I am able to measure the kind of footprint that I'm reducing on different things, carbon, beat water, whatever be the case, and also on top of that the sustainable development goals that I'm able to achieve, not just on paper but on by some kind of a data-based system which is able to track that, that would be an ideal thing. And that's what I aspire, that's what is my I'm very passionate about. That's what I'm working on at this point of time, to be able to build more robust systems around these processes.
I love it. And you can really hear the passion coming through there. I think it's a really interesting area. It's one that we've talked about a lot as well. Sustainability and specifically carbon credits, also carbon emissions reporting, that kind of thing. I think it's so ripe for disruption, and there's so many ways you could improve it, as you said. But I love that you highlighted the need for fairness, right? The fact that it is so much harder to do these things if you are a small enterprise, if you're a small organization or an individual entity, to try and contribute to the process that allows accurate carbon emissions reporting and carbon credits allocation. It is very difficult. There's a misalignment of incentives there. So I really like that you see the incentive game that you can play in Web3, and the fact that you can design these incentives and tokenomics and smart contracts and things like that. I think that is absolutely a great way to apply these technologies. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that insight, and I hope it's a successful project for you in the future. So, Nikhil, it's been, as Alex said, it's been such a great show. We always end with a couple of kind of open questions that we ask all our guests. We like to see, what the distribution of answers is here. So I'll ask you the first one if you're ready. In one sentence, what is Web3 to you?
So, in one sentence, Web3 for me is not changing the front end interfaces that we have in the current times, and having a backend system which enables fairness, democratization, and privacy.
There's a very new approach, I think, to answering that question. I like that it's more specific. It's a bit more techie than we usually get, than the kind of very grand vision. So I really like that. Okay, and then our second and final question then is, if you could choose anybody in the world from throughout history, they could even be, a fictional character or something like that, to sit down and discuss Web3 with, who would you pick and why?
I think the only person who comes to my mind when I talk about the Web3 aspirations or the Web3 projects that we are doing or that we should be working on is Mahatma Gandhi. One of the things that Gandhi always talked about, Gandhi ji, I should say, talked about is Swaraj. The idea of Swaraj is to be able to have self governance. And self governance, as we all know, is very difficult to achieve because everybody has different views. Web3 gives us that avenue to be able to self govern and self govern really well. So, Gandhiji's view was that we should not punish people who make mistakes, right? One of the things that has come in the current day society is, oh, if you have bad behavior, we'll kick you out and we'll celebrate, the rich people only. I mean, they're supposed to be the best people in the world, anyways. But his view was that, recognizing, acknowledging good behavior is the best thing that we can do, but we should not punish people who do not want to contribute to the society. There should be enough incentives for good behavior only. When I read this the first time about blockchain enables incentives for good behavior. I was like, oh, this is what Mahatma Gandhi mentioned all the time. We should have incentives in the society for good behavior. Altruism doesn't is not a sustainable strategy anyways, right? Greediness is not a sustainable strategy because there is no limit to greediness. But if as a society we do not get recognized, we do not get incentives to be able to do good behavior, like I talked about this farmer, yeah, if the farmer has to do sustainable farming, this farmer has to get some benefit from that sustainable farming. Maybe some are tangible, some are intangible. But to the farmer, as we all can tell, is making ends meet is difficult if there is nothing tangible that comes into them. We will not be able to sell them on the intangible benefits, rather. This is something which I feel resonates very closely with the thoughts of Mahatma Gandhi. And I would have loved to have sit down and discuss Web3 with him.
I love that answer. I think that would be such an interesting dinner and such a good, insightful dinner. I think another thing that I saw was around the idea of satya. That was one of the things that Gandhi promoted, right? The idea of truth being the foundation of all virtues. So I imagine like the idea of trusted data and a way to prove authenticity and truth as well would probably align. So yeah, that would be an incredible conversation. Nikhil, this has been great. I've learned so much, and I think there's so much more we can and will learn by getting you on again in the future. So all that's left to say is thank you for joining us, and thank you to those listening wherever you may be, and join us next time to untangle a little more of Web3. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Untangling Web3.
Don't forget to send us your thoughts, questions, and comments on social media. And be sure to follow us on your favourite podcast provider to catch the next episode. See you next time to untangle a little bit more of Web3.
The views we express here are our own and do not reflect the views of our employers.